The commander of Warhawk's Special Forces, Natasha, and the director of the logistics department, Farid, were having a meal at Cadis's imperial palace. King Javon Lorenz sat quietly next to them. Hundreds of thousands of fully equipped troops had been stationed in the country. It didn't take a genius to know why they were here. The war had nothing to do with Cadis. They were neutral and hadn't sided with either country, but they would be the ones to suffer the consequences. Javon could already imagine the war-torn ruins of his country after the war ended. Towns and cities would be razed to the ground, and civilians who'd lost their homes would move abroad. Foreign investments would shut down. Factories and corporations would be empty, and the economy would be on the verge of collapse. The medical facilities and buildings in the suburbs were already crowded with patients. The destruction during the war would free them from isolation, and the virus would spread to other countries. Miss Natasha, Mr. Farid, why not think this over? Javon said. Warhawk has many businesses in Cadis. There are no winners in this war. Natasha downed her wine in one gulp, as if she were celebrating Warhawk's imminent victory. It would be better if you accepted your fate sooner rather than later. The world can't be at peace until the U.S. is destroyed. We'll attack first and catch them by surprise. The border won't last more than 24 hours. She was beginning to slur, and her blind confidence didn't seem too reliable to Javon. Farid didn't respond. He continued to eat without a word, but he mocked her inwardly. He'd already sent a detailed report of Warhawk's military strength to Stephen. The U.S. wouldn't go down without a fight. Natasha patted Javon's shoulder. Your task is to kill the patients to provide a safe environment for our people. We've stationed hundreds of thousands of troops in Cadis, but this is only the beginning. We have many more on their way. Javon was in no position to refuse. He accepted his long list of tasks and left to get them done. Stephen didn't stay in Annapolis for long before heading to the eastern border for an inspection. The commander of the military base greeted him and introduced himself. He and his team were skilled in fighting in all kinds of environments. They were frequently stationed at different military bases across the country to hone their adaptability. If there was anyone who could formulate a strategic plan to counter Warhawk's siege based on information about their army and resources alone, it would be them. The commander led Stephen to the main building. There was a large map on the screen with different colored flags representing Warhawk's deployment of their troops. The cities near Cadis's border are under martial law. Warhawk's intelligence personnel are hiding there. Wealthy families and civilians have already left through various means. Their warships are docked on the port to assist the army through firepower. Hundreds of thousands of troops are spread across 2 rivers. They're less than 200 miles away from our border. If we notice any unusual movements, we'll block their path on land and the sky with our cannons. We won't let them cross the border. To minimize casualties, the commander's plan was to start off the battle with weapons and ammunition to deplete Warhawk's resources. A heavy industrial base had been constructed at the eastern border, and they had a vast supply of arsenal. They'd been enhanced with ores and crystals that Stephen brought back from other realms, and they were far superior to Warhawk's weapons. Because of Warhawk's advanced biochemical technology, at least half of their army consisted of artificial human bodies with AI chips. But their regeneration wouldn't be able to keep up with the enhanced weapons. They were predicted to be destroyed upon impact. In the evening, a motorcade of luxury cars approached the bridge near the eastern border. Crossing the 2 rivers was the same as trespassing on U.S. territory. The guards on patrol aimed their rifles at the vehicles. They were expensive, but they weren't bulletproof. A middle-aged man stepped out of the car with his hands raised in surrender. Wait, don't shoot. I'm an ambassador from Cadis. The king sent me. He gestured to the young man next to him. This is Nate Cassidy. He's the CEO of the Alliance Security Company. The guards weren't familiar with Cadis's ministers, but Nate's face was no secret. His identity did nothing but increase their suspicions. Why are you here? Are you promoting your company in the wilderness? Their sarcasm infuriated Nate, but he swallowed his anger. To preserve the royal family's authority and reduce Cadis's losses, Javon had sent him and one of his ministers to plead with Stephen. We're here to meet the former sovereign. Outsiders are not permitted past the border. If there's anything you'd like to say, let us know, and we'll pass on the message for you. Mr. Adams and I are family. Please make an exception for us, officers. The guards didn't give in. Mr. Adams is not a member of the Cassidy family. If you'd like to speak with him, make an official appointment. The motorcade had no choice but to turn around. The alchemist of the Demon Hunter Guild and the other mercenaries had returned to the Elysian realm. Nate and his two subordinates were the only ones left in Cadus. They were too afraid to go back to the U.S. and face the criticisms. When night fell, Stephen, the Ares clone, and Tristan put on disguises and crossed the eastern border. The Ares clone was concerned that something would happen to Stephen and that he wouldn't be enough to protect him. If they both died, no one would be left to save the real Thierry from Luciano. The Ares clone had informed his student, Tristan, of the situation and brought him along. Should we go ahead and wipe out the army? The Ares clone suggested. Most of them are artificial humans with superior regeneration, Stephen said. It'll waste too much time. Cadus's port was up ahead. It was brightly lit, but it was also like a ghost city. No one was around. The three of them could sense martial artists hiding in the vicinity, but dealing with them wasn't their goal. They dove into the water. Stephen pierced the steel plate at the bottom of one of the warships with his sword, and water surged through the hole. An alarm sounded from the control room, alerting everyone on the ship. A team was sent to check on the leak. Their weapons were stored at the lowest level, and they couldn't let them be corroded from seawater. The lights turned on, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor. The cabin was spacious, but the puncture holes were small. The water barely reached the soles of their shoes. They suspected someone had sneaked on board and damaged the plate. The warship was well maintained, and holes wouldn't have appeared out of nowhere. The engineer stayed behind to fix the plate, while the team searched the ship for the enemy. Stephen, the Ares clone, and Tristan were hiding underwater and assessing the situation above by listening to the footsteps. Did you come all the way here just to poke a few holes in their warship? The Ares asked. We could have just killed them. The point is to not alert the enemy, Stephen said. When he punctured the steel plate, the threadworms had reduced their size to that of an earthworm and flowed into the cabin with the water. They'd wriggled through the gaps in the wall to reach the artillery storage and sealed the barrels with a layer of iron sand. On the day the war broke out, Warhawk's army wouldn't be able to fire their missiles or cannons. They would explode from the obstruction in the barrels. The Ares wasn't impressed. So in the end, they still die. Sounds like a roundabout way to get rid of them. The most effective strategies in war are the ones that the enemy is least expecting. Whatever. Just remember your promise. We're going to Luciano's residence as soon as the City Lord challenge is over. The threadworms divided into hundreds of clones and sealed the weapons in the shortest amount of time. Once the enemy pressed the launch button, the warships would be on the path to destruction. The engineers fixed the damage with professional equipment. The warships were parked in shallow water, and they weren't that far from the maintenance station. Regardless of the damage, the ship could have been salvaged with no serious consequences. There was no trace of the enemy, so the troops on board could only wait for the engineer's analysis. When Stephen, the Ares clone, and Tristan swam to shore, a light armored car stopped in front of them, and they climbed inside. The city guards were the only ones who drove vehicles like this, but the driver tonight wasn't a guard. It was an undercover prisoner working at the 9 States Financial Group. The undercover prisoners understood that Stephen kept them around after freeing them from the cages because they were useful. They'd been living luxuriously with the support from the 9 States Financial Group. If they didn't work when they were needed and were tossed to the curb, there would be nowhere for them to go. They were wanted criminals from Warhawk, and they would be left to fend for themselves. The undercover prisoners disguised themselves and ransacked a hidden warehouse containing food, medicine, and other supplies from Warhawk. Stephen had obtained the warehouse's location from Farid. Before Warhawk's troops arrived in the country, this storage room belonged to the government. Javon was forced to collect the goods inside, clear out the space, and hand the warehouse over to Natasha. Cadus's guards are stationed so far away, Stephen observed. Tristan had learned a thing or two from his time in the military. They've probably lost confidence in the royal family, and they're not interested in risking their lives. Because of the virus and Warhawk's invasion, Cadus's economy and treasury had been declining. Military expenditures, salaries for city guards, and other expenses had been reduced. Everyone had lost their motivation. Warhawk would soon take over the country. The royal family would become their puppets and lose their authority. Javon had tried to fill the gap in with the national treasury by using his own wealth, but there was a limit to what he could do. His authority was declining fast, and his limited wealth couldn't motivate anyone to keep the country running. The Ares clone looked on impatiently. The undercover prisoners were martial grandmasters, while the city guards were ordinary people. Many of Cadus's martial artists had given up their posts because of the lackluster compensation. Even if the city guards confronted the undercover prisoners, nothing would change. Fieri couldn't understand why Stephen meddled in things like this. He was an ascender. He should be cultivating instead of wasting his time in a lower plane. The commander of the military base at the eastern border was calmly watching the undercover prisoners ransack warehouses across Cadus's royal city on the monitor. His deputy wasn't as patient. He could already picture Javon and his ministers exploding with rage when they discovered their prized and well-hidden warehouses that had been stolen from. Warhawk was responsible for maintaining security at the warehouses and ensuring their confidentiality. They wouldn't be able to avoid the blame. There were 30 multifunctional armored vehicles, 100 well-equipped team members, and plenty of ammunition at the military base. The commander's deputy was eager to teach Warhawk's troops a lesson. The warehouses are full of supplies from Warhawk. It's obvious they're prepared for an all-out war. When are we going to step in? The commander was a cunning man, and the battlefield was under his control. A large-scale war is about to erupt, but it's not time yet. We have to play our cards right to wrap up the battle in one go. When the undercover prisoners are done, fire a few warning shots to cover for them. 10 minutes later, shots from machine guns were fired across Cadus. At the signal, the undercover prisoners retreated. Many warehouses were ransacked, but there were 0 casualties. The terrible news reached Natasha. Farrad pretended to be stressed. He'd already predicted the U.S. would take action before the war officially began. Most of Warhawk's troops were stationed across the 2 rivers close to the border. By the time they returned to the city, the culprit would be long gone. Natasha ordered her intelligence officers to conduct an investigation with the city guards. The virus had spread quickly in Cadus, and there weren't that many personnel from Warhawk stationed at the warehouses to guard them. They were afraid of being infected, and no one had expected them to be robbed. Cadus's city guards were also few in number. "What are we going to do about our lost resources?" Farrad asked. "Should we arrange for another batch to be sent over?" "There's no time," Natasha said. "I'll go to the palace tomorrow and discuss this with the king. Maybe we can use Cadus's supplies." "Quite a few of our warehouses were targeted tonight. That means the others aren't safe either. Should we transport everything to the port to make it easier to guard?" "No, they're too scattered. Our people could be attacked on the way. Let's wait and see what the culprit does next." Natasha was cautious. She didn't know where the shots had been fired from, and she couldn't rule out the possibility that this was a distraction from the enemy. If she ordered the troops to come back to the city, it would give the U.S. the opportunity to invade. To be on the safe side, Natasha left the troops where they were and kept the warships locked onto the U.S. eastern border in case they attacked. Warhawk had a few people to spare, making it easy for the undercover prisoners to make a getaway. At dawn, Stephen returned to the military base at the eastern border with the Ares clone and Tristan, and gave the head of the Stonebrave family a call. "How strict has Cadus's lockdown been recently?" "Airlines and transportation by sea have stopped. Only certain civilians with special licenses are allowed to leave the border. The fishermen's routine is mostly the same as before. Some areas are restricted, but they've been allowed to continue their work in the coastal waters. Warhawk has taken over, but they can't let Cadus's citizens go hungry." There were no trace of tension in the head of the Stonebrave family's voice. The 9 States financial group had purchased his company, and his profits wouldn't be affected all that much. His only job was to collect dividends. "Can you smuggle someone in and out of the country?" Stephen asked. "That can be arranged. My company has many fishermen among the staff and fishing boats. It won't attract any attention. Do you have someone you'd like to bring to Cadus?" "No, it's the opposite. Contact the wealthy families in Cadus who haven't left yet and offer to bring them to the U.S. We'll guarantee their safety. They're also welcome to re-establish their companies here. If they stay in Cadus, Warhawk will divide their business and take their wealth for themselves." "Understood. I'll contact them right now." Just when Stephen thought everything was going smoothly, he sensed a powerful aura in the sky. He looked up and saw a group of mercenaries dressed in their respective guilds' uniforms. The elderly man in the lead was the alchemist from the Demon Hunter Guild. "Should we evacuate our forces?" the Leviathan unit's leader asked. After his encounter with Parodi and Cove, he understood just how strong cultivators from the Elysian realm were. If the mercenaries supported Warhawk and attacked the eastern border, it would be over within minutes. "Not yet. We don't know why the mercenaries are here," Stephen said. "Let's wait before making a decision." As they watched the mercenaries land in Cadus's direction, Stephen sensed another familiar aura. It was Fiona, and she was quickly closing in on the eastern border. She descended from the sky in a flash of golden light. Her aura had grown stronger since the last time they met. The City Lord Challenge was coming up, and Stephen guessed every member of the Sullivan family was cultivating day and night to prepare. The Elysian realm favored the strong, and weak existences would be eliminated. "We've finished repairs in Minori City and Seaflower City. As we expected, our rankings have dropped to the bottom. We'll have to hold a City Lord Challenge soon. Everyone in our family will be required to participate in the challenge to protect our position. Losing our authority is the same as dying on the battlefield." Stephen didn't understand why losing the challenge was equivalent to death. "It's not as bad as you think. Even if your dad loses his position, you'll become an ordinary wealthy family. What's so bad about that?" "Everyone knows how much wealth a city lord possesses. Once we lose our authority, we'll become their target. By the way, I heard you almost ruined the Alliance Security Company. I didn't know you were so skilled." "It wasn't me." Stephen introduced the Sky Lion to Fiona. "I couldn't have done it without him. He'll be participating in the challenge. There's nothing to worry about." The Sky Lion lit up at the mention of the City Lord Challenge. He confidently declared that he and his fellow beasts from the Asura realm would be more than enough to help the Sullivan family win the challenge. Fiona could sense the depth of the Sky Lion's aura, but Stephen's paled in comparison. If Stephen participated in the City Lord Challenge the way he was, he would have been killed without a doubt. She wouldn't know how to explain his death to her father or Ren. "If you're aware of your limitations, then please focus on cultivating instead of fooling around in the human realm." The lively atmosphere settled in Cadus's imperial palace with the arrival of the mercenaries. Nate was relieved to see them. Without the mercenaries, he had no authority. "Our company's reputation is dropping, and the customers are canceling their orders. Shouldn't you do something about this?" "Earning money isn't important now," the alchemist said indifferently. "We need to get rid of Stephen and the Bellantine family's company. What has Vivian been up to lately?" "She and her mercenaries are training on the outskirts of Annapolis," Nate replied. "They didn't participate in the battle with Mifflin, so they probably won't help the U.S. fight against Warhawk either." "Lack of ambition is the same as being weak. Forget about them. We'll restore our reputation by assisting Warhawk in the war." The alchemist led the mercenaries into the Imperial Palace. None of the guards dared to stop him. Javon was in the garden instead of spending his time leisurely watching his usual performances. To save expenses, the palace had cut down on unnecessary entertainment. Javon's daily entertainment had been reduced to admiring the flowers in the garden. The alchemist got straight to the point. "The war is about to start. What are your plans?" Javon hesitated, not knowing how to answer him. In truth, he didn't have the authority to plan anything. The royal family's authority had fallen to rock bottom. "Cadus is neutral," he said finally. "Then lend me your soldiers. I'll lead them alongside Warhawk's army, and we'll attack the U.S. together. We won't need to do much. We'll weaken their forces and let Warhawk take care of the rest." Javon was dumbfounded. If he openly sided with Warhawk, that would be the end of him and the royal family if the U.S. won the war. "We don't have enough people to assist Warhawk. We're barely scraping by. A thief stole from our hidden warehouses while you were gone, and we still haven't found the culprit." The alchemist gave him a pointed look as his aura surged. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm giving you an order. If you can't lend me your soldiers, then I'll kill you and make some more obedient to be the king." Javon scurried off to gather the soldiers before the alchemist could follow through with this threat. Compared to hundreds of thousands of troops, Cadus's army of tens of thousands of soldiers was negligible. The Leviathan unit's undercover intelligence team didn't notice the purpose behind Javon's sudden motivation. They assumed he was afraid and was gathering his soldiers to strengthen the security at the Imperial Palace. The days passed, and the war between Warhawk and the U.S. broke out abruptly in the middle of the night. Both sides fired their cannons, and the explosions could be heard far and wide. For safety reasons, Stephen had instructed everyone at the military base to move to a hidden underground command center. The ceiling shook as Warhawk bombarded the eastern border. The commander of the eastern military base didn't send out a single soldier. For the next few hours, they fired back with enhanced artillery shells. In the morning, Warhawk's bombardment let up. The commander knew the troops didn't have much ammunition left. The next batch of supplies would take at least 5 hours to arrive. Stephen received a call from the military administration building in Annapolis. Mr. Adams, Kata sent a delegation to our public relations department. They're protesting the bombardment of their cities near the border. Stephen was confused. What are they playing at? The civilians in those cities evacuated a long time ago. Both of their countries knew about the war ahead of time, and most of the destruction would take place in those cities. Even if the civilians didn't leave on their own, the government had more than enough time to get them to evacuate. Warhawk had a way of tricking people. They claimed they had allies across the world, but Maplewood was only one country that provided any form of support. Javon was cowardly and ignorant, but Stephen believed he wasn't that stupid. Maybe this was his way of surrendering to the U.S. because he couldn't openly side with Warhawk's enemy. Give Cadus's delegation the usual reception. Tell them we're open to negotiations about compensation and we'll discuss the rest after the war. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Warhawk's bombardment ceased completely. From the satellite, the commander could see that their army had divided into squads. They'd abandoned the cities near the border, which meant that they were also leaving a considerable amount of their resources behind. There was a limit on how much armored tanks could carry. Should we continue firing, Mr. Adams? They're still within range. Let's wait. We don't know how many of them there are left. Natasha was caught off guard by the artillery shells from the U.S. She was relying on the troops' regeneration, but their artificial bodies were destroyed upon impact. Are they out of their minds? If they use up their ammunition on us, what about Mifflin? Aren't they worried they'll have nothing to spare for them? We're fighting a war near U.S. territory, Farad said. Their production lines are advanced, and the structure of their shells is simple. There is no guidance or remote control system. Firing in a parabola is the only factor they take into account. As the director of the logistics department, he understood how much went into the production of weapons. The simpler the product, the faster they would be produced. The U.S. would probably be able to replenish the ammunition they used up by tonight. The situation was even more serious than Farad was describing. If Warhawk's troops couldn't get close to the border, this war would be a waste of time and resources. It cost a large amount of money to transport hundreds of thousands of artificial soldiers from Warhawk, not to mention weapons, food, clothing, and housing for maintenance and repair personnel. Before we run out of resources, we have to destroy their military base, Farad continued. We'll charge as soon as we have a path. Natasha was getting restless. She accepted Farad's suggestion and ordered the troops on board the warships docked at the port to fire. Long-range missiles were scattered warheads weren't cheap. Each one was worth tens of millions. Even the United States' advanced air defense system wouldn't be able to block all of them. The artificial soldiers began to move on the ship. The missile launcher rose, and they locked onto the eastern border with precise coordinates from the satellites. The moment the button to launch was pressed, an explosion tore through the inside of the missiles and engulfed every warship in flames. Natasha was observing the eastern border with binoculars. 15 minutes had passed, and nothing had happened. What is going on? Her team on standby attempted to establish a connection with the troops on board. We've lost all communication with the warships. Something must have happened to them. What are you talking about? Their firepower system can strike both land and air simultaneously. If there was an ambush, they would have put up a fight, and there would have been at least one explosion at the border. Her team checked the satellites to obtain an image of the port. The water was burning with flames, and remnants of the warship floated on the surface. The hull of the ships weren't combustible, but the ammunition and fuel stored at the lower level were. Natasha was in disbelief. The enemy hadn't ventured close to the port, and there was nowhere they could have landed without being spotted. She gritted her teeth in frustration. Ever since she arrived in Cadis, she hadn't been able to fully utilize her experience, nor had Warhawk's biochemical technology been pushed to the limit. Maybe the ships were defective. Send a team to the port to find out what happened. I'll need to explain myself to the head senator when we get back. Stephen also received news that Warhawk's fleet had been wiped out. At this point, Warhawk's combat strength at sea was non-existent, and their aerial attacks had been weakened. When the warships exploded, dozens of aircrafts on the decks had gone up in flames. The time had come to launch a counterattack. The commander went up to Stephen to ask for his opinion. Warhawk's escape route has been cut off. If we lead our troops across the border, we can end this battle. Not yet. Give Warhawk time to prepare more troops and ammunition. Stephen's thoughts were always unpredictable. Was he planning to drag the entire country of Cadis under? When everyone turned to Stephen with puzzled expressions, he went on. According to our intel, at least half of Warhawk's army is artificial, but it's getting more likely that all of them are. They think highly of their advanced biochemical technology, and they value their artificial soldiers more than their real troops because they're nothing more than consumables that can only be used once. The person behind every cannon, missile, and firearm was a robot, carrying out a single string of commands entered into the computer. If we show our full strength too early, we'll scare Warhawk away. Let them have hope of winning and make them use up their supply of artificial soldiers. Javon was hiding in the Imperial Palace with his ministers, and he was shaking in fear as he listened to the reports to the battlefield. Warhawk's casualties meant nothing to him, but the once prosperous cities had been reduced to rubble. What's happening with the delegation we sent to the U.S.? Javon asked. You don't think sending them there made it look like an act of aggression on our part, right? They're receiving the usual reception, and they're currently negotiating compensation, one of the ministers replied. The United States' reaction to their delegation was normal, but the battlefield was ever-changing. It was hard to say if they would still be this friendly in the future. Another minister stepped forward. Their attention is on Warhawk. They don't have time for us. If we do anything out of line, we'll have to pay for it later. Javon was worried about the same problem. Regardless of how the war turned out, Cadis was a neutral country caught between the conflict. Whichever side lost could easily pull their forces out and retreat back home, leaving Cadis vulnerable. The ministers began to argue amongst themselves. Then what should we do? Should we ask the delegation to change their stance and admit our faults? That doesn't make any sense. We never had a choice in becoming enemies with the U.S. Warhawk and those cultivators from another realm forcefully took over. In my opinion, we should try to persuade the mercenaries to stay out of the conflict with our army. What are our soldiers supposed to contribute in a war between major powers anyway? At most, they'll be sacrifices. Well, who's going to talk to them? An awkward silence hung in the air. The alchemist had threatened to kill Javon and make someone else king. Why would he and the other mercenaries listen to the ministers? A minister broke the silence. War requires extensive logistics support. The mercenaries alone can't manage an army by themselves. We can try to make an issue out of our supply of resources and stall for as much time as we can. We'll wait until the victor is more clear-cut. If Warhawk has a higher chance of winning, we'll support the mercenaries and let them join the war with our army. If the chances are higher in the U.S., we'll claim our soldiers are guards at the border and that they were only defending their own territory. With a nod from Javon, their plan as fence-sitters was finalized. After a detailed discussion with the alchemist, they prepared resources for the army's expedition to the front lines. As the conflict gradually subsided, Natasha and Farid needed more support from Warhawk's parliament, so they arranged for more resources to be sent over. But the mercenaries were eager to take the stage. More than 10 armored vehicles from Cadis drove to the edge of the battlefield. The alchemist and a middle-aged mercenary peered out the window at the eastern U.S. border, observing their defenses. A war between humans is far from entertaining. They've been fighting for so long, but there's still no decisive results. I suppose this is what happens when both countries have advanced weapons, but the fact remains that this is a lower plane. How did you let 8 of our mercenaries die without knowing what happened? The middle-aged mercenary wasn't thrilled with the alchemist. The chief intelligence officer of the Falcon Guild and his team had mysteriously disappeared, and 8 mercenaries had been killed under the alchemist's watch. The top 3 mercenary guilds of the Haven domain had formed an alliance, and to outsiders, they were similar to a powerful martial arts faction. But there was a limit to how much each guild could hide their ambitions and competitive nature and pretend like they were on good terms. "I understand what it means to be a mercenary," the alchemist snapped. "None of us are soft-hearted when carrying out missions, but Stephen has a unique identity. He's a member of the Mystic Covenant. If we casually kill him with no justifiable reason, the faction will come after us. We need to assassinate him." "Is that so? Then show me how capable he is," the mercenary prompted. Warhawk's troops had scattered and hid across the border, giving the mercenaries a prime opportunity to take action. The alchemist told 200 fully armed soldiers from Cadus's army to come forward. He poured powder onto his hand from a porcelain bottle and tossed it over the crowd. They grimaced from the pungent smell as they erupted into a coughing fit. After a short disturbance, their eyes turned dull and lifeless. They stood where they were in a daze, but their auras had risen sharply. Their strength had doubled, and they'd become the alchemist's loyal puppets. "Spread out and approach the border strategically. Kill the enemy at all costs," he ordered. Cadus's soldiers ran toward the eastern border with no trace of fear at the incoming rain of bullets. Radar didn't work on living things, but the high-resolution binoculars installed at the sentry post had alerted the U.S. Army of a dense crowd of troops coming their way. They fired the cannons to stop their advance. Several rounds of volleys lit the battlefield with flames once again, but Cadus's soldiers were unharmed. They maintained their momentum, charging towards the border at full speed. Right before the projectiles hit, a layer of energy had covered their skin, forming a protective barrier. They ran through the shockwave from the explosion and the surging heat. As long as they weren't hit by the shells directly, the barriers made them invincible. The military's higher-ups at the underground command center stood up in alarm at the appearance of a strange group of enemies who'd charged through the firepower unscathed. Not even their clothes were damaged. Stephen, Fiona, and the Sky Lion observed the monitor. "Are they mercenaries?" Fiona asked. "It's possible," Stephen said. "They wouldn't have come back to Cadus just to watch the war on the sidelines." The martial artists on the screen had condensed a barrier of energy on their skin, and they were charging through thousands of rounds of bullets fired from machine guns, dodging left and right. Their speed and strength surpassed most of the martial artists in the human realm. On closer inspection, they were wearing the uniform of Cadus's army. "Cadus's royal family is launching an attack alone," Stephen continued. "They're willing to become sacrifices for Warhawk." Fiona was skeptical. "It's rare for human martial artists to be this strong. Are they cultivators from the Elysian realm pretending to be part of the Cadus's army?" "That can't be it. If this many cultivators from a higher plane came to the human realm, we would have lost our border already." The Empyrean Circle took out their weapons one after another. They'd been sitting on the sidelines ever since the war broke out, and they were getting restless. They followed Stephen up the stairs, but as soon as they reached the surface, a tremendous aura appeared in the sky. Stephen slashed with his swords, releasing a storm of energy that dispersed the clouds. The alchemist came into view. He was hovering in the sky, stroking his beard with a smile. "You're a cultivator of a higher plane. Why are you interfering in a war between humans?" "The U.S. is my home," Stephen said. "It's only natural for me to be here. But why are you and your mercenaries on the battlefield during a war between humans?" The alchemist had already thought of an excuse long ago. "We're here to do business. The whole world knows we've signed a business contract with Cadus's royal family to protect them. The U.S. broke the peace and blew up our cities near the border. Our retaliation is justified." The mercenaries around him weren't interested in small talk. They brandished their weapons and lunged for Stephen. Fiona, the Sky Lion, the Ares clone, and Tristan didn't hesitate to join the battle. Everyone else understood that these cultivators weren't martial artists from the human realm, and it wasn't their place to fight. Stephen instructed the military officers to gather their troops and retreat from the border. Mass destruction accompanied battles between cultivators from a higher plane. Their military base and underground command center could be destroyed. The military officers immediately made arrangements for their people to evacuate, leaving behind a small team to stop at Cadus's soldiers as much as they could. As old enemies, Stephen's opponent was the alchemist. "You want to compete with me again? Will you summon all your beasts this time?" the alchemist provoked. "This is a battlefield, not a sparring ring. There are no rules or restrictions. I can and will kill you." Stephen only summoned the threadworms. Their constant consumption of ores and crystals had increased their defenses beyond typical beasts. A flask appeared in the alchemist's hand, and silver threads shot through the opening, forcing Stephen to step back. Even the ghost fire couldn't predict the trajectory of the alchemist's strange weapon. Stephen's sword burned with the killin's aura as he threw out a wave of golden flames. He had to resort to long-range attacks. If he accidentally stepped too close, the silver threads would chain him up. The alchemist looked bored as he watched Stephen struggle. "Why aren't you summoning your other beasts? Underestimating me is a mistake." "They don't want to see your face," Stephen replied, putting some distance between them. He condensed a ball of heavenly light on his palm and tossed it at the alchemist. Lightning from the heavens was the final trial of every martial artist in the human realm before ascension, but the silver threads made quick work of them. When the lightning vanished with an insignificant flare of electricity, a sandstorm swirled to life. The alchemist put on a bracelet of prayer beads. A holy light shone above, and the phantom of a god appeared. With a wave of the phantom's hands, the sandstorm dispersed. Stephen summoned the threadworms back to his spiritual world and braced himself. Evacuating the military was not a simple task. They needed time. If he left halfway into the battle, the alchemist would make Cadus's soldiers turn their border to ruins. Stephen rushed into the air and created 3 clones of himself. This was an advanced version of the Leviathan unit leader's clone technique, and it was a secret cultivation technique that Ren had taught Kim, but he allowed her to teach Stephen because they were married. His clones wielded weapons from Lapis Lazuli Tower and prepared to attack. There was a limit to how many clones Stephen could create for himself. 3 was the maximum, and each one was a perfect replica of his real body. Ordinary clones divided one's spiritual energy evenly among them, which weakened the body. But Stephen's clones contained his cultivation, experience, and skills. Stephen placed the Berserker's blessing on his arm, and he infused its power into his sword. A cage of light appeared around the alchemist's phantom. The ghost fire transformed the cage into swords of light. They fell from the sky like rain, targeting the phantom as Stephen's clones closed the distance. The phantom's arms swept over the swords, shattering them on impact into particles of light. The alchemist met Stephen's clones head-on just as they lashed out with their sword, axe, and chain. The alchemist struck each of them in the chest with his fist in quick succession and sent them flying back. Cracks spread over their bodies as blood dripped onto the ground. "How is he doing that?" Stephen asked the ghost fire. "It shouldn't be that easy to damage a clone." "Just like how he refines cultivation pills and weapons, he must have refined his energy using the furnace, too," the ghost fire guessed. "Energy is like a flame when it's released. As their density increases, they'll become liquid or even a solid. His manifestation isn't a typical phantom. It was created using his refined energy." Stephen didn't have a chance to register the ghost fire's explanation. The alchemist vanished and reappeared in front of him. He threw back his fist, ready to strike. Stephen raised his arms to block the blow. A rush of wind and a powerful force knocked him out of the air, sending him careening towards the ground. Before he could crash into the earth, a shadow appeared on the surface and swallowed him as he made contact. Tristan had stopped Stephen's fall with his shadow, hiding them both inside the independent space. "How much longer are you going to stay here?" "Behind me is my country. I have to buy at least enough time for my people to retreat." Tristan had exchanged a few hundred blows with the mercenaries before slipping away. There was a big difference between their cultivations. Fiona and the Skylion were evenly matched against the mercenaries, but only because they were preserving their strength to prepare for the City Lord challenge. They couldn't waste their energy in the human realm. As for Thierry's clone, he was running around in circles, avoiding a direct confrontation with the mercenaries. "You've done enough," Tristan said. "The military's already far from the border. It's time to go." As a wave of explosions erupted at the border, Stephen and the others retreated using the smoke as a cover. When the dust settled, the rest of Cadus's soldiers arrived at the border. The alchemist lifted his hand, dusting off another earth-shattering explosion, more destructive than the ones before. The deafening sound reverberated across the land, and the satellites of the countries overseas captured the devastation. Cadus's soldiers set up camp as the mercenaries voiced their opposition. "Why did you let him get away? Annapolis isn't that far from the border. We could have killed them and stopped them from getting reinforcements." "The U.S. has a high population density," the alchemist said. "If we chased after them, there'd be casualties among the civilians. It goes against the laws of the heavens for cultivators like us to wreak havoc on a lower plane. Besides, I have something to discuss with Cadus's king." The eastern U.S. border had fallen, and all the mercenaries had to do was wait for Warhawk's army to regroup. When the humans blew each up and their population began to decrease, the mercenaries would deal the finishing blow to Stephen and his people. The mercenaries followed the alchemist back to the Imperial Palace. Javon was at a loss for words. His eyes were wide with shock as he stared at them like he'd seen a ghost. The alchemist was strong, but Javon didn't know he was this powerful. The mercenaries had single-handedly pushed back the U.S. forces. "Contact Warhawk and have them station a team at the eastern U.S. border," the alchemist ordered. "We need to attract the world's attention and make the neutral countries side with us." Javon wiped the sweat from his forehead. The mercenaries had escalated the war to a point of no return. The U.S. would definitely pin the blame on Cadus's royal family. Warhawk's army is too spread out. It'll take them a few days to regroup. "Then help them," the alchemist said dismissively. "This isn't the end of the war. We have many more battles to fight, and we need to make sufficient preparations." Cadus's royal family wasn't thrilled by the mercenaries' victory, and the U.S. wasn't dejected over their fallen border. Once Stephen and the others made it back to Annapolis, they gathered in the conference room to come up with a new plan. Cadus's army had joined the war, and Warhawk was in the process of transporting another batch of resources to the port. The mercenaries wouldn't attack civilians, but the same couldn't be said about the U.S. officials. The task of taking down the mercenaries had fallen on Stephen and the military's upper management's shoulders. Everyone sat in silence. Before entering the room, Stephen had informed Kim of the situation at the border and asked her to notify the Mystic Covenant. The faction's goal was to maintain peace across the 6 realms. They wouldn't stand by and let the mercenaries cause chaos in the human realm, but they were also slow in taking action. The only person he could count on was Ren. Fiona wasn't optimistic. The Mystic Covenant is on friendly terms with the Mercenary Guilds Alliance. They're searching for the ancient cultivators together. It's unlikely for them to fall out with each other just because of a war in the human realm. "So what you're trying to say is there's no hope for our country," Stephen said. "I'm only telling you the truth based on facts. I suggest you use the time you have remaining to cultivate and focus on ascending. Once you reach the Elysian realm, you'll be protected by the rules in the cities." It was impossible for Fiona to mobilize the cultivators in her family. They were preparing for the City Lord challenge. Vivian's family wouldn't play much of a role either. They were a typical wealthy family who'd established their own mercenary guild, and they were nowhere near the Mercenary Guild Alliance's level. "Are you telling us to abandon our country?" a military officer demanded. "To reach the true immortal realm, you have to harden your heart and let go of your desires. Worldly affairs are nothing more than a distraction." In some ways, breaking through to the true immortal realm was harder than passing the heavenly trial. This was a talent that very few human martial artists possessed. As the military's upper management mulled over Fiona's words, an international broadcast pulled them up from their thoughts. Warhawk was condemning the U.S. for waging war against Mifflin, demanding for them to recall their army and provide compensation immediately. If not, their allies would have to join the war. On the surface, they were pleading for peace, but their real goal was to reap the benefits from aiding Mifflin. Mifflin's government had been quiet lately, and it turned out they'd been spending their time roping in allies to defeat the U.S. An administrative staff member hurried into the room and informed Stephen that Warhawk had formally extended an invitation to the sovereign to head to the frontier and participate in negotiations. He'd retired, but he would always be the sovereign to the rest of the world. It was obvious Warhawk was trying to use this invitation to put pressure on the U.S. Jace turned on the projector and pulled up a map of Warhawk on the screen. Before the war broke out, the U.S. military had sent a fleet to intimidate Warhawk and its allies. Our warships are equipped with intercontinental missiles with a range of 12,000 miles. Each missile carries 18 warheads, and they've been enhanced with ores and crystals. Even if Warhawk and their allies activate their air defense interception systems, more than half of the warheads will hit their target. Escalating this conflict isn't the answer, Stephen said. Warhawk's allies haven't started an official war with us. They've sent an invitation as a formality. They're just trying to make things harder for us. When does the meeting begin? Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the administrative staff replied. Are you really going to meet with them? The faster we wrap up negotiations, the sooner we'll be able to get back to focusing on our borders. We only have one night left. We have a lot to do. Issue an announcement to the international media that the U.S. will be conducting a space exercise. Jace, will it be possible to destroy their satellites at midnight? This was an important matter, and Jace couldn't carelessly give his guarantee. He contacted the specialists at NASA. Half an hour later, he received a reply. To strike the satellites, they would need to increase the altitude of the intercontinental missiles by a third and expand the fuel capacity. But the satellites of the countries overseas were classified, and it would be difficult to lock onto them. It doesn't matter, Stephen said. If we miss, the target will only be off by a slight margin. Explosions are stronger in a vacuum. The pulsar radiation will destroy the electronic components inside the satellites. It was a sleepless night for the countries overseas. They were paying close attention to the United States' space exercise. Everyone thought the U.S. was bluffing and trying to intimidate Warhawk and their allies with their declining military strength. Observatories around the world aimed their high-definition telescopes at the night sky, waiting for the demonstration. At midnight, a missile was launched into the sky on U.S. territory. It was an adjusted intercontinental missile, and it only took a few seconds for it to exceed Mach 20. The U.S. space station activated its anti-magnetism shield. As the missile disappeared into the sky, the darkness of the night returned. Every country maintained their connection with their satellites at a specific electromagnetic spectrum. A blank meant that their target had disappeared. The satellites moved in a circular trajectory, but the missile was expected to explode in a three-dimensional spherical range. Accidentally affecting unrelated satellites was unavoidable. Can you confirm which of the satellites were destroyed? Stephen asked. The phones are ringing non-stop at our Foreign Affairs Department, Jay said. Whichever countries were affected, we'll know soon. Warhawk and their allies as officials were gathered at a resort, enjoying the beautiful and tropical environment, when they found out about the United States' space exercise. Warhawk's prince, Brent Robinson, the commander of the Unsetting Sun Empire's fleet, MacArthur, 2 military advisors from Mifflin, and many others were among the officials. They were preparing for their journey to the front lines for negotiations with the U.S., but they weren't expecting their satellites to be destroyed. The officials set their phones down on the table with grim expressions after receiving the news. Does the U.S. really think they can cover up what they did by using their space exercise as an excuse? This is ridiculous. What's the point in negotiating with them? Just invade their country and take over. That's easier said than done. How are we supposed to accomplish that if we don't have our satellites? Seeing that some of the officials were wavering, Brent stood up and expressed his opinion. Warhawk's satellites aren't that badly damaged. We can share our data. The eastern U.S. border has fallen, and we can access their territory through there. We don't need guided missiles. Several officials stated that the priority was to minimize risks to their own countries to stay in the public's good graces. Profits from the wars were secondary. They requested Warhawk's artificial soldiers take the lead. They were robots. It didn't matter if they were destroyed. Brent agreed. We'll be sending 200,000 troops to Mifflin. Any hope of peaceful negotiations had gone up in smoke. Everyone was determined to fight. A large map was unfurled on the table with several routes outlined with a marker. Mifflin had promised that if their allies could help them win the war, they would build a highway leading directly to their countries and leave the management authority in their hands. Winning the war meant that they would be free to plunder the U.S. territory and transport the resources to their respective countries through the highway. The size of Warhawk and their allies varied, but they had one thing in common. The resources in their countries were limited. On their own, they couldn't form a complete industrial system. With the outbreak of war, ores, crystals, and other resources were slowly leaving the international trade market. After crushing the U.S. and establishing a transportation channel, they could take all the resources they needed. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the opposing parties arrived at the Aratai Mountains for negotiations. The dangerous terrain had been blown up during the battle between the U.S. military and Perodian Cove. Even the fortress the U.S. was so proud of was nowhere to be seen. The U.S. guards at the border had put together a few sentry posts in the shortest amount of time possible for negotiations. "Don't you feel any regret at the destruction around us?" Brent asked, making a show of looking around the partially destroyed mountains. "This happened because of the U.S." "Are you more sentimental and forgetful now that you're getting old?" Stephen countered. "Did you forget about your army invading Cadis and setting up camp at our border? They don't seem to be there for a vacation." At the negotiations table, the three higher-ups with the most authority were Brent from Warhawk, MacArthur from the Unsetting Sun Empire, and Stephen from the U.S. The others were there to make up the numbers, and they would be more important during the votes. The atmosphere turned hostile. MacArthur was the first to speak. To compensate for the losses caused by the war, the U.S. should recall their troops as soon as possible. They must also take responsibility for the damages to our satellites from their space exercise last night and offer sufficient compensation. Every official nodded, except Stephen. Various industries in their respective countries had been affected by the damage to their satellites. The most serious included satellite communications, television media, cloud computing data storage, and military operations. Launching a satellite cost tens of billions, and the total destruction last night accounted to a sum that was at least 10 times higher. "Is that all?" Stephen asked. "Why didn't you include the conflict at the eastern border?" "What does that have to do with us?" MacArthur retorted. "Cadis's army took over your border. You should negotiate with them instead." "If you want to talk about losses, let me remind you that during our war with the Alliance many years ago, Warhawk and Mifflin played a crucial role. The U.S. suffered heavy losses. And let's not forget about how you stationed your army at the northern border some time ago. We're just returning the favor. Compensation isn't necessary. If you want to join the conflict, then go ahead. Feel free to use your guided missiles without your satellites." No one expected Stephen to be so firm. The U.S. had lost their eastern border, and they needed time to adjust their strategy. He should have at least shown some respect during negotiations. "It looks like you're underestimating us. To help our ally, Mifflin, through this crisis, we can only use force to resolve the issue," MacArthur threatened. The negotiations had fallen through, and the two military advisors from Mifflin were conflicted. Mifflin and the U.S. had a tacit understanding with one another. The flames of war didn't spread to the cities around Lake Isaiah. They mainly fought in the desert, and most of the destruction in the cities was from the officials who'd fled. If other countries joined in, Mifflin couldn't guarantee that they would preserve the cities and the civilians. Stephen waved the Leviathan unit over, and they escorted the officials to the exit. MacArthur cursed once he was inside the armored car. When the Unsetting Sun Empire was at the peak of their glory, they'd established numerous overseas colonies around the world. They weren't as powerful as they used to be, but that didn't mean someone as young as Stephen had the right to look down on them. "Let's strike while the iron is hot. I need to see the U.S. in ruins with my own eyes." The military advisors from Mifflin spoke up at the same time. "Excessive firepower is not allowed in the cities. Reduce the destruction to minimum and preserve our mines, oil wells, power stations, airports, and other basic facilities." "Our people depend on Lake Isaiah. It would be a disaster if it's polluted from war." Before the battle even began, Warhawk and their allies were faced with restrictions. The officials weren't pleased. Casualties and destruction were unavoidable in war. If they didn't go all out, how would their assistance be any different from playing house? "It's better to suffer short-term than long-term. Our goal is to get rid of the U.S." "That may be the case, but Mifflin's economy will never recover if you destroy Lake Isaiah," Mifflin's military advisor argued. "The profits from winning the war aren't enough to make up for the damages. We have a safer method. We'll set up a fortress near the Aratai Mountains and cut off the connection between the U.S. and the cities around the lake to prevent reinforcements from coming to their aid. Then we'll wipe out their forces one at a time. The more they prolonged the war, the less beneficial it would be. The amount of expenses required for sustaining such a large army wasn't small, but since this was what Mifflin had decided, the losses would be on them. The U.S. military's upper management was filled with righteous indignation when they returned to the command center in the cave. Warhawk and their allies haven't arrived in Mifflin yet. Should we attack them first? Liam suggested. Dragging other territories into the war doesn't benefit anyone, Stephen said. It only makes the battlefield more spread out and complicated. We'll limit the conflict to Mifflin for now. Warhawk and their allied countries have varying military strengths. The weakest will drop out eventually. 24 hours later, Warhawk and their allies set off for Mifflin with great fanfare. Not only did they want to win the war, but they also wanted to show off their strength. Desert surrounded the Aratai Mountains. To the south of Lake Isaiah were rivers that extended to the edge of the desert, where a few villagers had been built. They planned to station their troops there. Their army consisted of 300,000 troops, but they weren't in a hurry to attack the U.S. Army. Instead, they buried mines in the sand to make it harder for U.S. troops to enter and leave the mountains. An unmanned aircraft circled the sky overhead, sending images of their movements to the U.S. command center in the cave. There was nothing special about the mines, but the U.S. Army had 100,000 troops stationed in the lake's vicinity, as well as a large number of caravans. If the roads were blocked, they would have to take detours to enter some of the cities. It was clear that Warhawk and their allies were waiting for them to exhaust their resources and energy before trekking across the desert. The U.S. military officers decided to test Warhawk's air defense system with their strategic bomber. A low rumble sounded from the forest as an aircraft soared into the sky. Its 120mm anti-aircraft turret could rotate 360 degrees, and its internally controlled radar could lock onto any flying target within a 5-mile radius. Warhawk countered with their own advanced weaponry. Their troops stationed at the villages transported air defense cannons across the desert in different directions to avoid being wiped out by one round of gunfire. The U.S. aircraft fired, and a rain of bullets fell over the desert. Because Warhawk's troops were so far away, there was a delay between the time the bullets were fired and when they reached their targets. It wasn't an accurate aim either. Warhawk's troops weren't stationary, and the U.S. military had to protect their locations before firing. When it was clear that Warhawk's cannons and anti-air missiles would overwhelm the aircraft, Stephen ordered the pilot to turn the plane around and retreat. The military officers suggested facing Warhawk's army in the desert with their own heavy artillery, but he didn't think that was a good idea. It'll be harder to reach some of the cities, but we have sufficient supplies. The towns and cities of the western border can also provide support. Let's wait and see how Warhawk reacts when they realize their plan isn't as effective as they think it is. We need to focus on taking the eastern border back. Stephen left Jace and Liam at the command center to manage the military and went back to Annapolis with the others. On the plane, he received a call from Farid. Mr. Adams, Maplewood has transported a new batch of resources to Cadus, and Warhawk's troops have regrouped. On behalf of Warhawk's Parliament, Natasha met with the Security Alliance Company, and she agreed to expand their business to Warhawk in exchange for the mercenaries to join the war. Stephen knew the mercenaries wouldn't give up until they took over the U.S. Their cooperation with Warhawk was just a pretense. This was their excuse to attack the U.S. Did Natasha have any requests? Natasha will have full authority during the battle, and they're intent on eliminating the entire U.S. Army and the civilians. You should evacuate the civilians near the eastern border as soon as you can. Stephen replayed Farid's warning in his head after ending the call. There were countless factories and research institutes near the eastern border. When Cadus and Warhawk's armies approached, these facilities would be turned into ruins. Hundreds of millions of civilians would need to be evacuated before the war reached them, and their displacement would drive the economy to the ground. The Sky Lion was sitting next to the window 2 seats down from Stephen's and had listened in on his call with Farid. He didn't understand why Stephen was so stressed. What's there to worry about? If worst comes to worst, I'll ask the other beasts to help. A one-sided battle is a bit boring, but they won't pass up on the opportunity to have some fun after so many weeks of doing nothing. Stephen considered the Sky Lion's offer as a last resort. The beasts were battle maniacs. They were destructive, and they didn't pay attention to their surroundings when they fought. This was lethal in a lower plane where half the population weren't martial artists. If the beast joined the battle, there wouldn't be an eastern region anymore after the war was over. A war couldn't be won on strength alone. The more interferences from other realms, the more variables there would be. There was also the chemist's strange obsession with beasts to worry about. Let's observe the mercenaries for now. Our priority is to preserve the towns and cities. The next morning at 5 o'clock, the sun had just risen when Warhawk and Cadus's armies charged towards the eastern border with tens of thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. The commander of the eastern military base had mobilized their heavy arsenal the day before. He instructed his team to fire. They couldn't let the enemy get close to the cities. A large-scale battle had begun. The cannonballs turned the eastern border's vicinity into a sea of fire. The ice dragon flew overhead with Stephen, Fiona, and the Sky Lion on its back. They didn't see the mercenaries anywhere, which meant this was an ordinary battle. Fiona wasn't that interested. To cultivators of the Elysian realm, there was nothing fascinating about explosions from advanced human weaponry. As the ice dragon circled the area, Stephen's eyes were glued to his phone. It was synchronized with the command center, and he had a view of the battlefield in real time. Their consumption of ammunition was shockingly high. The battle had only been going on for an hour. It was hard to imagine the casualties once the commander of the eastern military base sent out soldiers. Warhawk and Cadus's armies were putting up more of a fight than the last battle before the mercenaries interfered. The alchemist must have given them more of that strange medicine. Stephen regretted not letting the Zodiac beasts kill him during their first spar, despite the rules and the enemies he would have made. If I killed him earlier, things wouldn't have gotten to this point. Fighting on two fronts consumes plenty of resources. Warhawk would have used up their supply of artificial soldiers already. Alchemists aren't that strong, but they add many variables to a fight, Fiona said. When those with lower cultivations are involved, alchemists are harder to handle than most cultivators. While Stephen was deliberating what to do next, a crack in space appeared from not too far away. A group of cultivators from the Elysian realm emerged from the rift. He recognized the two young men in the lead. They were Ren's students, Emmett and Seth. He assumed the rest of the group were also his fellow students. Ren had taken many members of the Mystic Covenant under his wing, and Stephen hadn't had a chance to meet them all. When Kim informed the Mystic Covenant of the war and the mercenaries' presence in the human realm, most of the elders had dismissed her concerns, but Ren couldn't ignore her. They were teacher and student. He had a responsibility to help her and Stephen. Emmett and Seth waved at Stephen. "It's been a while. I see you've gotten yourself caught up in another crisis," Emmett said. "We just arrived in the human realm, and the first thing we see is a battlefield." "Is this what you've been up to instead of cultivating?" Seth asked. "Are you planning on expanding your country's territory?" Stephen was glad to see them. "Please stop messing with me. The Mercenary Guild Alliance is interfering in the war. If this continues, they're going to destroy our country." The rise and fall of a country or a realm was part of the laws of nature. Emmett, Seth, and the others didn't see anything unusual about it. "Remember, you're an ascender," Seth advised. "Your life exists on a higher plane, not here. After this, try to avoid getting caught up in the human realm's mess again." "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks for coming," Stephen said. He covered Cadus's imperial palace with his aura to provoke the mercenaries. With Ren's students around, he was more confident in kicking them out of the realm. It didn't take long for the alchemist and the mercenaries to arrive on the battlefield. On the way here, the alchemist had been puzzled as to why Stephen was so fearless today. When he saw a group of Mystic Covenant members around him, he understood. "Did you call them over to help you? I assume this means you want to settle the grudge between us." Emmett and Seth stepped forward and addressed the alchemist politely. The purpose of their visit was to settle the conflict peacefully. The Mystic Covenant and the mercenaries both have a good reputation in the Elysian realm. We should set an example for others. This is a simple competition between security companies. the alchemist replied. If you want to make peace, then have the U.S. surrender and hand over their army to our company. His condition for a truce was unrealistic. If the U.S. gave up their army, who'd be left to defend the country? It was clear that the mercenaries had no intention of backing down from this war. Anger welled up inside Stephen, but he left the talking to Emmett and Seth. If they couldn't come to an agreement, then they would have no choice but to fight. As a last resort, the beasts from the Asura realm would also participate. Sure enough, the alchemists had no plans to leave. If a fight broke out and there were casualties among the Mystic Covenant members, then he would claim that they'd interfered in a battlefield where anything could happen. Standing around and talking is a waste of time. Let's begin. Is that your decision after thinking it through? Seth asked. The mercenaries responded in the alchemist's stead by unleashing a torrent of energy at Stephen. Ren's students casted an array together to block the blow. The resulting explosion was stronger than that of the battlefield below. The light was so bright that Warhawk and Cadus's armies had to close their eyes. Stephen ordered the commander of the Eastern military base and his team to retreat. The battle in the sky would escalate soon, and they had to leave now. The mercenaries' storm of energy grinded against Ren's students' array until they lost their momentum and crashed into the ground. A deep crater opened up below, swallowing Warhawk's artificial soldiers who couldn't dodge in time. Stephen knew he was no match for the alchemist. He asked the ice dragon to fly towards the mercenary at the edge of the group instead. When they were in range, Stephen condensed 3 clones of himself, and they lunged for the mercenary with their sword, axe, and chain in hand. The shrill sound of metal against metal made Stephen's ears ring. The ice dragon condensed a wall of ice to block any residual energy from reaching them. Stephen casted his domain of hellfire. Blue flames spanned the sky, creeping closer to the mercenary to absorb his spiritual energy. The mercenary drew a circle with the tip of his sword to form a barrier of energy to separate himself from the flames, but Stephen's clone didn't let him finish. He threw out his chain and wrapped it around the mercenary's sword. The chain flared with electricity. Tristan leaped out of the shadows and plunged his knife toward the mercenary's chest. As the astral thief student, he was always unpredictable. The mercenary had years of experience, and he reflexively dodged the fatal blow, but he couldn't avoid it completely. Tristan's knife left a deep wound in his shoulder. As his blood stained his shirt, there was a purple tint to it. The knife had been poisoned. Flustered by the revelation, the mercenary took out a pill to dispel the poison. He was infuriated that a martial artist from the human realm had gotten a hit on him. He tightened his grip on his sword and slashed in Tristan's direction, releasing a blade of light. Tristan ran back to Stephen in a flash and merged with the shadow. I thought you were going to fight with me. Isn't that why you showed yourself? I'm not an ascender. Landing a hit on him is already an achievement. The rest is up to you. Good luck. Since the last time they fought together against a common enemy, Tristan hadn't changed one bit. The ice dragon condensed a blizzard. The chill of the snow invaded the mercenary's body. It was so cold that he could barely breathe. He'd taken the pill, but not all of the poison had been removed. It was slowly eroding his skin, muscles, and bone. If he wasn't careful, he'd be killed. The mercenary infused his energy into his sword, shattering the chains binding it. The metallic fragments struck Stephen's clone, riddling him with holes. Stephen dispersed his clones and condensed a phantom of the fire phoenix to take their place. It dove for the mercenary and enveloped him in flames. The opposing energies of ice and fire clashed inside his body. The phoenix took advantage of the opening and added another layer of flames. The mercenary tried to break free from the raging fire, but any damage he did to the phoenix healed instantly. Stephen formed a barrier and rushed up to the mercenary, taking hold of his arms. He activated the slits on his palms and began to absorb his spiritual energy. This was the first time Stephen had used this technique on someone with higher cultivation. The mercenary's energy poured into him and filled his meridians. He felt like he was on the verge of exploding. The shadow beneath Stephen's feet moved, and Tristan jumped out with his knife in hand. Stephen held the mercenary in place as Tristan drove the knife into his heart. The mercenary fell and turned into a pool of blood on the ground. Tristan flashed a triumphant smile. Finishing off our enemies at a critical moment is my specialty. Stephen motioned to the mercenaries Fiona and the Sky Lion were fighting. "There's more of them over there. I should let you clean them up." "I don't think so." As quickly as Tristan appeared, he vanished inside Stephen's shadow. The other mercenaries turned to Stephen when they sensed one of their members' life forces vanished. They didn't see their fight, but he was obviously the cause. As the battle intensified, both sides unleashed more destructive techniques. Ren's students casted another array. Swords of light rained over the mercenaries. Each one was a different color corresponding to their element. They complemented and restrained each other, amplifying their damage output. The alchemist tossed his miniature furnace into the air, and it enlarged into the size of a small mountain, blocking the swords. The furnace's exterior had been tempered, and it was sturdier than typical weapons. "Find an opportunity to kill Stephen," the alchemist said. "Don't let him get away." 2 mercenaries separated from the group and charged through the Phoenix's wall of fire to get to Stephen. The flames caught on their clothes and dissipated in seconds. The high temperature didn't seem to have any effect on them. The mercenaries rushed up to Stephen with clenched fists, ready to beat him to a pulp. He didn't dodge. He grabbed their fists with his bare hands, taking the blow head-on. The aftershock of the impact tore a hole through the ground below. The 3 of them were sent flying in opposite directions. The mercenaries were surprised by Stephen's strength. "He's only at the silver rank. How is he so strong?" "I think he consumed a cultivation pill." In actuality, Stephen had absorbed a large amount of spiritual energy from the previous mercenary, and he'd also placed the Berserker's blessing on his arm. He was overflowing with power that exceeded his real cultivation. The Phoenix reduced its size and flew around him, transforming into a barrier of flames. Stephen and the 2 mercenaries rushed at each other again. A gust of wind accompanied every blow they exchanged as shockwaves overturned the ground. Natasha and the commander of the Eastern military base had retreated from the battlefield with their troops. They were waiting outside the range of destruction. Ordinary people and typical martial artists from the human realm couldn't follow movements of cultivators from higher planes, but the damage to the terrain was clear. Farad could tell that the U.S. Army was at a disadvantage. He advised Natasha to retreat. "The battle in the sky is unpredictable. We don't know how it'll turn out. We should leave while we still can." "Their battle won't continue forever," Natasha said. "We'll keep going after they leave. There's no time to delay. Maplewood isn't providing resources for free. Once we use up the recent batch, we'll need to wait for more, and there's no guarantee they'll agree to keep assisting us. Forcing our troops to fight when the advantage isn't clear will lead to unnecessary casualties," Farad pressed. "The higher-ups won't tolerate that. They need the public's support to maintain their position in Parliament." Natasha didn't budge. "If we act fast enough, they won't have time to protest our actions." Warhawk's Parliament had given Natasha full authority of the battlefield, but Farad had the freedom to report the situation to the head senator anytime and anywhere. He lit a cigarette as a cover and went to a secluded area to contact Paxton. He needed to persuade him to change the commander to a more cautious one to give the U.S. more time to prepare a counterattack. Paxton was in his office at Warhawk's Parliament. The room next door had been empty ever since he was elected the new head senator. It had recently been renovated with luxurious furnishings for the ancient cultivators. Parodi and Cove had been staying there for the past few weeks. As Paxton was reviewing the report on the front lines, he received a call from Farad. "I've been waiting for an update. These reports aren't detailed enough. What's happening at the border?" "When our troops were about to press for the advantage, a group of powerful martial artists from another realm showed up to fight the mercenaries. We and the U.S. Army were forced to clear out the battlefield to prevent unnecessary collateral damage to our people. Before they arrived, the U.S. Army bombarded us relentlessly. We have around 50,000 soldiers left. I recognize the weapons they used. They were the same shells the U.S. dropped in the ocean during their combat drill. To even the battlefield, we'll need to use nuclear weapons." Farad's request was impossible to approve. It had been decades since the creation of nuclear weapons, but 99% of the countries had signed an agreement to prohibit their use and prevent the world from being destroyed. The weapons the U.S. had developed were enhanced with top-grade ores and crystals. They didn't emit radiation, so they weren't restricted by the agreement. Paxton had heard about the mercenaries' special identities from Perotti and Cove. He was planning on having the mercenaries take the lead, while Warhawk's army followed and picked up the scraps. The U.S. is known for their superior firepower, but it's not enough to determine the outcome of the war. Based on my intel, Cadis's mercenaries are strong allies. They help you push past the border. Farrad expressed that he agreed with Paxton's point of view very much, but Natasha was too passionate about military exploits and wanted to kill the U.S. military's higher-ups with her own hands. She didn't care about the casualties. A majority of Warhawk's army was artificial, but the public cared more about the numbers. Even if they won the war, it wouldn't look good to return to Warhawk with their entire army annihilated. When the war began, Commander Natasha ordered our fleet to attack the eastern U.S. border. There were combustible weapons stored at the lower level at aircrafts on deck. Her reckless actions destroyed the entire fleet. Paxton wasn't pleased to hear that. A warship cost billions to construct. The losses of each one would be more than 100 billion if they were equipped with aircrafts, and this wasn't even including the weapons and equipment stored on the ship. Warhawk's parliament didn't have an endless supply of funds. They needed to budget wisely. I understand the situation. Give me some time to reevaluate Natasha's qualifications. Before then, do everything you can to help her keep the war going. Farrad hung up, feeling satisfied with the result. The losses and casualties would be enough to persuade Paxton to send a new commander to replace Natasha soon. Farrad looked up. The explosions in the sky had died down. Among the crowd, Stephen stood out the most. He didn't know how Stephen was facing off against two mercenaries on his own when his cultivation was so low compared to theirs. The two mercenaries were looking worse for wear. It was a stark contrast to Stephen. The threadworms had secretly condensed a layer of iron sand over his skin and clothes. Whenever it was broken, they quickly replaced it with a new layer. The mercenaries were adamant about burning Stephen's bones and scattering his ashes for what he did to their companion. They drew a pattern on their skin with their blood. It glowed bright red. Stephen suddenly felt a surge of aura around him. The mercenaries were in front of him, but the presence of their auras contradicted their positions. Without warning, the mercenaries closed the gap and swung their fists. Stephen easily blocked their attacks, but a series of blows struck him in the back, sending him skidding across the air. When he stopped, another flurry of punches reached him, but the mercenaries hadn't taken a single step. Stephen knew it wasn't because they were moving so fast he couldn't track their attacks. Judging from the strange glowing diagram on their arms, they'd activated some kind of strange array. As the layer of iron sand drifted away in the wind, Stephen leaped onto the ice dragon's back. Just as the ice dragon was about to put some distance between them and the mercenaries, an unseen force slammed into its wings, stopping it from behind. The ice dragon dove for the ground and transformed into a young man in white right before landing. His human form was more agile and dexterous, making it easier to dodge attacks. There's something strange about their array, Stephen said, landing next to the ice dragon. When the mercenaries activated their array, he'd felt their auras surround him. It was like the purest form of a domain with no miscellaneous effects like amplification or weakening. Its sole purpose was to spread out and attack the target from their blind spots. Because their power was spread thin, the target wouldn't be able to sense the attack coming. The ice dragon watched the mercenaries fly toward them. Take out the lapis lazuli tower. They're coming for us. When the tower enlarged, Stephen and the ice dragon rushed inside just as the invisible force crashed against the door behind him. A rainbow-colored light rippled from the tower. The mercenaries felt a heavy pressure press down on them, slowing the circulation of their blood and energy. Their array contained a large amount of their power. It was easy to cast, but not as simple to retrieve. The mercenaries cautiously summoned two wolves to test the tower. One of the phantoms was white and the other was black. Their howls reverberated across the clearing. As the tower shook from the sound wave, the wolves scampered up to it, scratching with their claws, and tried to bite through the exterior. The tower had a built-in self-defense feature. It gathered the spiritual energy from the air and struck the wolves, shaking them off. The two mercenaries debated whether to give up or continue their fight. The strange tower was impenetrable, and as long as Stephen hid inside, they wouldn't be able to get to him. The power they'd infused into the array was spread across the area. If they left without getting it back, it would be the same as wasting their energy for nothing. The mercenaries sheathed their swords and materialized a battle axe. It wasn't as easy to swing as it was slow, but the tower wasn't going anywhere. When their axes struck the glass exterior, the tower crashed into the ground. Smoke and dust filled the air. Tristan transmitted his voice to Stephen. "Get ready to leave the tower. They can't see through the smoke." Stephen slipped past the door as Tristan's shadow slid along the ground. Stephen gathered the phoenix and the ice dragon's spiritual energies into a ball of fire and threw it into the mercenaries' direction. The mercenaries blocked with their axes, but the fire burst and covered them in a thick layer of ice. They didn't know how Stephen had mixed ice into the flames. The mercenaries shook off the ice as they glanced at their companions. The alchemist and the other mercenaries were staying close to the furnace as they fought, using it as a shield when necessary. The array Ren's students had casted was profound, but it couldn't destroy the furnace. The swords of light melted when it came in contact with the flames. While the two mercenaries were observing the battle in the air, they didn't notice that their shadows had turned darker. Stephen created 3 clones of himself, and they each charged at the mercenaries, drawing their attention onto them. 2 sharp knives shot out of their shadows and struck them in the back. It was too late by the time the mercenaries felt the pain. The poison was rapidly spreading. Their resistance to poison wasn't as high as the previous mercenary, and they didn't have poison-dispelling pills on them. They staggered, and Tristan dealt the finishing blow. Like Stephen and Tristan, the Sky Lion had also taken down 3 mercenaries with some help from Fiona. The alchemist had lost 6 of his team members. He was outraged, but there would only be more casualties if they didn't fall back and come up with a new plan. Ren's students, including Fiona, were holding back because they couldn't completely fall out with the mercenaries. But their support made it easier for Stephen and his people to gain the upper hand over the mercenaries. The alchemist waved his hand, detaching the lid from the furnace. A pillar of flame shot into the clouds and began to absorb the spiritual energy in the air. A rain of fire fell from the sky as the mercenaries made their escape. Fiona saw Stephen in a new light. His cultivation was low, but he was able to use the environment and the abilities of the people around him to take down the cultivators who were much stronger and much more experienced than he was. He would be a valuable asset during the City Lord Challenge. Ren's students were worried even though they'd driven the mercenaries away. It was risky to come to the human realm and side with the U.S. Before the problem with the ancient cultivators was resolved, they needed to avoid making new enemies. If the mercenaries turned on the faction because of what happened today, Ren would have to take responsibility. However, it was normal for conflicts to arise between cultivators, leading to unexpected casualties. Neither party had violated any rules, so maybe the situation wasn't as serious as it seemed. "Stephen, don't come back to the Elysian realm for the time being," Emmett warned. "We need to put in a good word for you to smooth things over." The rain of fire continued to fall, turning the land into a sea of lava. None of the soldiers or the vehicles could pass through the area, so Natasha finally gave the order to retreat. She was disappointed by the outcome. If the battle in the sky didn't happen, Warhawk and Cadus's armies would have crossed the eastern U.S. border and reached the cities by now. The commander of the eastern U.S. military base also ordered his team to retreat. They weren't that far from the eastern port, and there were sufficient resources to replenish the ammunition they'd used up. Stephen and the others went back to the military administration building for a briefing about Mifflin. Warhawk and their allies' armies had settled down in the villages at the edge of the desert, and they were living comfortable lives. Mifflin's government was providing supplies and accommodations for them. The days without war were like paid tourism. At this rate, Stephen didn't think it would take long for Mifflin's treasury to be emptied. Living expenses were cheap compared to maintenance of weapons and equipment. The sand and dry climate could reduce their precision if they weren't properly maintained. Most of the army's weapons had been built with Warhawk's humid climate in mind. The higher the population, the more active the regional economy, the Leviathan unit's leader said. Before the war, Mifflin, Warhawk, and their allies were engaged in trade. They've planted mines and blocked our routes, but they haven't attacked the cities. The civilians and the merchants' lives are the same as before the war began. There are over 100 million people living in the cities near Lake Isaiah. If Warhawk attacks, they'll be destroying their own economy. The Empyrean Circle and the Guardians of the Palace are prepared for the conflict to escalate. They're waiting for an opportunity to assassinate Warhawk's commander. Warhawk's strategy of a long-term blockade had its advantages. If they publicized their army's heroic and fearless image to the media, it would garner support from other countries, hoping to get a share of the profits when the war was won. Capital would flow into their hands. Is there any way to bypass the mines they've set up in the desert? Stephen asked. There's a river to the south of Lake Isaiah that flows into the U.S. and the villages. We can send a team to swim to the villages, but they won't be able to carry any heavy weapons. That won't be a problem, Stephen said. They won't be going there to fight. Their goal is to empty Warhawk's resources. No one knew how long it would take before the rain of fire from the furnace was extinguished. Warhawk and Cadis's armies would be on standby until the path was clear. In the meantime, Stephen's priorities had shifted to Mifflin. At night, a team of 30 soldiers prepared to infiltrate the villages. They packed light. Most of the supplies were canned food. Mifflin had constructed a reservoir by the river, and it was the main source of electricity for the cities. Based on intel from the front lines, the reservoir was heavily guarded, and it was highly likely that Warhawk was storing their supplies nearby. The team was estimated to reach the reservoir within 24 hours. Warhawk and their allies' army consisted of mainly artificial soldiers and typical martial artists. If it went well, the team's journey to and from the reservoir should be smooth sailing. Even so, the military's upper management sat in silence in the conference room, worrying about all the things that could go wrong with the operation. It was Stephen's phone that broke the silence. Mr. Adams, Head Senator Paxton is thinking of finding a new commander to take Natasha's place, Farrad reported. What kind of commander is he looking for? A more capable one? From what I've seen, Natasha is skilled. He's not happy with the losses. What he wants is a commander who doesn't rush headfirst into battle and actually preserves their forces and military equipment. Slowing down the pace of the war would be beneficial to the U.S. Fighting on two fronts was complicated to manage, but this decision wasn't up to Paxton or the other higher-ups. It was up to Parodi and Cove, who hadn't shown their faces since the last battle in Mifflin. Paxton doesn't have the authority. He can't make the call, Stephen pointed out. The two cultivators from another realm aren't interested in trivial matters like these. I believe he'll get his way. We'll just have to see then. I'll go to Cadis and see what I can do to prompt him to take his case more credible. After Stephen ended the call, everyone raised objections. No one knew the exact location of the mercenaries. Going to Cadis was too risky. It won't be that hard to find Warhawk's army, Stephen reassured them. The mercenaries are probably at the Imperial Palace. I won't run into them. The Sky Lion flew Stephen across the ocean to Cadis. The port and the royal city were brightly lit, but it was dark everywhere else because of the curfew. Cadis's royal family lost their authority, but they still hold irreplaceable positions in the country. If we kill them, it'll cause more chaos among the civilians and make it harder for Warhawk's army to stay here. It hasn't been long since you came to the human realm, but you've gotten smarter, Stephen praised. Killian would be proud when you return to his side. I'm a fast learner, the Sky Lion bragged. In theory, assassinating a kingdom's upper management was a good idea, but it wasn't that practical in practice. The deed came with complicated consequences. Stephen didn't rain on the Sky Lion's parade, though. Just because the radical tactic didn't work as well in the human realm didn't mean it wouldn't be effective in the Asura realm. The Sky Lion landed in an obscure area in the mountains. There were dark green tents all around. Warhawk's army had set up camp here. Natasha was in the main tent, inspecting the map on the table. She wouldn't be able to gain the Parliament's support unless she won the war. This highway extends to the cities in the eastern U.S. port. The border is blocked by the rain of fire, but we can enter their territory through the highway. Farrad nodded absent-mindedly. Why are you agreeing so easily? Natasha asked suspiciously. Whenever she wanted to attack, Farad wanted to retreat, but this time he was agreeing with her without question. Should I not have? As you said, our resources will be used up soon. How are we supposed to maintain such a large army? We should take the initiative. Farad knew his reply didn't have much meaning. Before then, Stephen would definitely interfere. He doubted Warhawk's army would make it off the mountain in one piece. In the morning, Stephen and the Sky Lion watched the chaos on the mountain. Last night, the Sky Lion had poisoned the batch of supplements stashed near the camp. Many of the artificial soldiers had been deactivated or destroyed by poison. Unlike Natasha and Farad, the artificial soldiers took synthesized nutritional supplements to replenish their energy. Stephen spotted Farad running around, pretending to be busy. He'd warned him not to carelessly touch the supplements and accidentally get himself poisoned. Farad was surprisingly useful. He had access to intelligence that even the Leviathan unit didn't have. They'd accomplished what they came to Cadus to do, so Stephen decided it was time to head back. But the Sky Lion wasn't ready yet. He was interested in the mercenaries staying at the Imperial Palace. We've traveled this far. We can't return empty-handed. Our battle yesterday drained their energy. We should attack while they're not in peak condition. That's a bit risky. There's only 2 of us. We'll kill some of them secretly and run away before they realize what's happening. To beasts, fighting could progress cultivation. They could devour their enemy and absorb their spiritual energy. It was a primitive and efficient method. The Sky Lion was adamant, and Stephen couldn't leave him to his own devices in enemy territory, so they blended into the crowd and made their way to the Imperial Palace. The king and his ministers were trying their best to stay out of the mercenaries' way after they stormed back to the palace yesterday. They were fuming at their loss, but there was nowhere to vent their frustrations. The alchemist hadn't assigned them any tasks, because the more they messed up, the more responsibility he would have to shoulder. Stephen is cunning. He has allies from this world and the Elysian realm who are willing to take risks for him. Expanding our influence to the human realm won't be that simple. Should we give up? One of the mercenaries asked. We're trying to hire more cultivators to join our alliance. If people find out about our defeat in a lower plane, who would work for us? The alchemist sighed. If he knew this was going to happen, he wouldn't have come back to the Elysian realm. He would have left the mess to the advisor of the Thousand Hands Guild. We should lay low until the City Lord challenge. Fiona is one of Stephen's allies. Maybe all of them are going to participate in the challenge. Once they leave, no one will be able to stop us. The mercenaries weren't too thrilled with the alchemist's plan. They were vengeful, and if it were up to them, they would have infiltrated the U.S. and torn Stephen to shreds already. But they also understood that it was risky. If there were any more casualties, they wouldn't know how to explain themselves to the guild leaders. Cadus's streets were no longer as lively as they used to be. There were guards stationed every 5 or 10 steps. The civilians shuffled along in silence, too afraid to talk to one another. They were worried about drawing suspicion to themselves and getting mistakenly executed as spies. Stephen and the Sky Lion walked past the Alliance Security Company's magnificent office building. When they didn't sense the mercenaries' auras, they sneaked towards the Imperial Palace. Stephen noticed Nate wandering the palace, which meant the mercenaries were staying there with him. Without the mercenaries' support, he was a weakling with no connections. The world was in chaos, and the best form of protection was to stay close to the mercenaries. Should we capture him and interrogate him? The Sky Lion asked. He doesn't know anything. We can already sense the mercenaries' auras from here. There's nothing for them to do in the human realm except cultivate. They scaled the side of the Imperial Palace and observed each building. The king had arranged a different courtyard for each of the mercenaries. No one was allowed to disturb them unless it was an emergency. None of the guards were on patrol. With the mercenaries' cultivation, why would they need protection in a lower plane? The Sky Lion pointed at a building in the rear. I smell herbs. I think the alchemist lives there. You're targeting the alchemist? Stephen asked incredulously. He's more troublesome than he looks. I want the cultivation pills in his furnace, the Sky Lion replied. They inched closer and watched as the alchemist added herbs to the pill furnace. He closed the door and sat down on the floor with his eyes closed, entering a meditative state. With that many herbs, it would take several days to refine a cultivation pill. "Is there a way to knock him out and finish him off quickly?" Stephen asked, although he was doubtful. "I'm a beast, not a magician." "You're so unreliable. You're the one who insisted we come here." Stephen glanced back at the alchemist through the window. The moment they made a move, they would have exactly 3 seconds to deal with the alchemist and steal his furnace before the other mercenaries came running. This task was as difficult as scaling the heavens. Stephen thought it over, and the only real option he had was the iridescent dragon, whose specialty was mental techniques. "Every time you summon me, there's a powerful cultivator in front of us," the iridescent dragon complained. "We just want his furnace," Stephen said. "We'll leave as soon as we get it. Your abilities were made for quick escapes." The iridescent dragon sighed. Life had become more complicated ever since Stephen came along. "The plan is simple. First, cast your bubble and cover him. The more layers, the better. Affect his mental energy as much as you can." Stephen gestured to the Sky Lion. "Then he'll throw his poison jade in the alchemist's face to interfere with his vision and perception. And lastly, I'll rush in and finish him off." Of course, Stephen had to handle the most dangerous step by himself. However this turned out, they would be out of there in 3 seconds, with or without the furnace. He concealed his aura, and the 3 of them made their way towards the building. In the middle of the alchemist's meditation, he sensed something amiss. He opened his eyes and found that his surroundings had turned pink. His head was covered in some sort of energy shield. There was someone lurking in the dark. The alchemist burst the bubble and moved to stand up and kill the culprit, but his legs didn't budge. When the bubble popped, the droplets had connected with his mental energy and enveloped him in an illusion that made him think that he was paralyzed. The Sky Lion tossed a poison jade through the window and struck the alchemist's face. It shattered, and black poison mist entered his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. The poison corroded his skin and turned his sclera a rotten black color. Stephen leaped through the window, infused the ice dragon's spiritual energy into his sword, and impaled the alchemist in the chest. Ice spread from the wound and turned him into an ice sculpture. With a slight push, the alchemist's body collapsed, shattering into fragments as he hit the floor. Stephen tossed the miniature lapis lazuli tower into the air. When the door opened, a light enveloped the pill furnace, and it disappeared in a split second. Even the fragments of ice that contained parts of the alchemist's body were drawn into the tower. At the 3-second mark, the chaos in the palace began, but the 3 of them were already gone.
"Our teamwork was flawless," Stephen beamed at the iridescent dragon and the Sky Lion within the safe cover of the clouds. "With you 2 around, we'll be unstoppable." The iridescent dragon had no interest in risking its life. The alchemist was focused on the furnace. If it were any other mercenary, they would have discovered our little trick the moment I cast the bubble. Don't expect this tactic to work next time. "But this is still worth celebrating," Stephen said. The alchemist had been after him and the beasts ever since their first spar. He was also the reason Cadus's army had gotten so strong. With the alchemist gone, there was one less thing to worry about. The iridescent dragon rolled its eyes and turned into a ball of light before returning to Stephen's spiritual world. The Sky Lion didn't share Stephen's excitement either. He'd worked hard for an entire night and morning, but he didn't get anything out of it. He didn't see any cultivation pills lying around the room. The pills in the furnace were incomplete, and the alchemist was dead. "Why didn't you let me swallow him? His spiritual energy is valuable." Stephen ruffled his hair. "All right, don't be upset. He's an alchemist. He has to have expensive cultivation pills on him. If not, we'll wait for the pills in the furnace to finish." Chaos had erupted at the Imperial Palace. The alchemist was nowhere in sight, but the mess in his room and the remnants of poison on the floor indicated that he'd been caught up in a fight before he disappeared. The mercenaries didn't think the alchemist was in any danger. He always carried life-saving pills with him. He couldn't die that easily. If he wasn't in his room, that meant he'd left to chase after the trespasser. The guards stared after the mercenaries as they flew out the window to search the city for the alchemist. They didn't know what to do.
Their cultivation was too low to be of any help. As the mercenaries roamed the city aimlessly, Stephen and the Sky Lion went back to Annapolis. The furnace was an ancient treasure. It had to be stored in a safe place to avoid unnecessary attention. The first place that came to Stephen's mind was the underground shelter below the military administration building. The heavy metal gate rose, and they entered the elevator. The Sky Lion was fascinated as he looked through the glass at the miniature underground city. What is this place? Why is it under the ground? It's a shelter for my country's upper management, Stephen said. That's why you built it down here? Just because it's underground doesn't mean cultivators from the Elysian realm can't find it. The Sky Lion predicted that one sword strike and a few blades of energy could destroy the underground space and bury the city in ruins. I don't plan to hide here. Cultivators from the Elysian realm aren't interested in this underground space anyway. The elevator came to a stop, and the glass doors opened. Stephen confirmed his identity and entered the gravity room with the Sky Lion. The room was empty except for a metal platform at the center. Stephen pressed a few buttons on the control panel embedded in the wall, and the pressure instantly increased 100-fold. He and the Sky Lion weren't affected. What are you doing? Are you trying to contain the furnace in a high-pressure room? The Sky Lion asked, confused. I'm just trying it out. If the pressure is this high, most people in the human realm won't be able to step inside. Stephen took the furnace out of the tower and placed it on the metal platform. The flame was burning steadily. Through the cracks in the lid, he saw the herbs had turned to liquid, but they hadn't become granules yet. The Sky Lion crouched and peered through the cracks. How long is this going to take? Maybe 2 days, Stephen guessed. Well, if they never become pills, I'll just consume the liquid. Stephen sorted through the ice fragments on the floor and gathered a pile of items. He pointed to 2 porcelain bottles. What do you think these are? Poisons or tonics? The Sky Lion opened the bottles with no hesitation. A strange fragrance filled the room, making his nose crinkle. He tossed the pills into his mouth like they were candy. His anti-venom was one of the best among beasts. Even if it was poison, his body would be able to eliminate it and absorb the spiritual energy the pills contained. Stephen held up the alchemist's flask and examined the silver threads inside. When he used this during battle, these threads tracked me and my weapon. How did he control them? You probably have to learn the martial arts technique it's associated with, the Sky Lion said. Normal threads are too soft to cut like a blade. Stephen picked up a ring from the pile. It was storage space, like the lapis lazuli tower. Items with spatial properties were rare and extremely expensive. He made a small cut on his finger and let the blood drip onto the ring to be recognized as its new owner. He infused his spiritual energy into the ring and searched the space within. He has all kinds of pills, herbs, prescriptions, and maps. I guess these are an alchemist's essentials. The Sky Lion didn't ask for much. He only wanted some of the cultivation pills. Stephen gave him more than 100 and saved the rest for the other beasts and for his personal use. Stephen decided to analyze the herbs with the Book of Life later. As for the rest of the items, he would leave them in a ring to be used in emergencies. He unfurled a map on the floor. Unusual locations across the 6 realms were recorded. I didn't know he was a traveler. He's been to so many places. I don't think all of these welcome outsiders. Maybe he bought the map at a high price, the Sky Lion said. Or he could have forcefully opened a spatial rift. That's true. The mercenaries have unique abilities. There has to be someone in their guild alliance who's capable of traveling across realms. How else would they have come here? If there's a chance in the future, I'd like to visit these places too. They chatted as they sat down and waited for the pills in the furnace to be refined. The pills were finished sooner than they expected. Crackling sounds echoed in the quiet room. Through the cracks in the lid, they saw 9 pills inside. Judging from the amount of spiritual energy they contained, the pills would be useful. Cultivation pills were more valuable to beasts than humans, but consuming too many of them had diminishing returns. The Sky Lion had had enough, so he took a few and gave the rest to Stephen. The mercenaries continued to search for the alchemist as the days passed, but there was no sign of him. Eventually, they gave up and admitted that the Mercenary Guild's alliance's most important member had been met with misfortune. The alchemist was assassinated. The number of cultivators capable of that is limited in the human realm. The ancient cultivators haven't made their appearance in a while. The culprit had to have been Stephen. Let's force our way into Annapolis and bring Stephen's head back to the higher-ups. Where are you getting your confidence from? You've seen how strong his team is. We've had so many casualties since we established our security company in the human realm. If we go after him recklessly, we'll lose even more of us. Remember what the alchemist said before he died? We should lay low and wait for the City Lord challenge to begin. The mercenaries' hatred for Stephen had been engraved in their bones, and their resentment would not end until they killed him with his own hands. Over the next few days, Stephen waited for news from Cadus, but nothing came. The mercenaries were keeping a low profile. The Leviathan unit's leader entered his office to give him an update on their latest operation. The team of 30 soldiers had made it to the reservoir in Mifflin. They were hiding in the forest to recover their energy and familiarize themselves with the terrain. After the war broke out, Mifflin had tightened their security. There were hundreds of guards patrolling the reservoir. Stephen looked at the map. The river ran through Mifflin's villages and cities in the United States' Western Plateau. Minimize the damage to the environment. If we accidentally destroy the reservoir, it'll flood the villages and the cities. It's an important water source for the civilians. The guards aren't that strong, the Leviathan unit's leader said. The team might not even need to use their martial arts. Okay, let's begin the operation. The 30 soldiers were dressed in black. They blended into the darkness and approached the reservoir. The captain of the team adjusted his glasses, where a high-definition camera had been installed. It was connected to Stephen's screen. Our target isn't the dam, generator, or the gate, the captain explained. It's that white building next to the camp where the patrol guards are staying. They take turns guarding the building. We'll render the guards unconscious using sleeping gas and steal from their warehouse without them knowing. Stephen watched the captain and his team put on gas masks before making their way through the grass to the white building. He knocked the guard at the entrance unconscious with one blow to the back of the neck and tossed a smoke bomb through the crack in the door, filling every room with sleeping gas. The team waited for the gas to take effect on the guards. Then they slipped into the building and cut the wire connecting the security cameras. The preparations were complete, and all that was left to do was search for resources. Mr. Adams, this room is full of machine guns, rifles, and grenades. There's also a rocket launcher, but it's too heavy to bring with us. The team had to swim a long distance to make it back to U.S. territory. With no means of transportation available, the amount of weapons and ammunition they could carry was limited. Hijacking an armored vehicle wasn't an option either. There were automatic tracking turrets set up near the vehicles. The difficulty of the operation would go up significantly if they attempted to steal one. Take what you can from the warehouse, Stephen said. Be careful and don't alert the enemy. The team strapped what they could to their backs and sneaked out of the building, returning the way they came and preparing for their swim back. The cities around Lake Isaiah were as peaceful as they were before the war. The mines buried under the desert made it difficult for resources to cross the western border, but everything else was under control. The Leviathan unit's leader outlined a route on the map with a marker. Warhawk and their allies are transporting weapons and supplies across the sea to Mifflin's ports to sustain their army. Stephen knew what he was getting at. Warhawk and their allies had set up landmines around the Aratai Mountains, and from a tactical perspective, it was reasonable and plausible for the U.S. Army to use their tactic against them. However, this would lead to other problems. The transportation route involves many countries. Not all of them are allies with Warhawk. If we ruin it, it'll affect their economy and our international trade. The Leviathan unit's leader was a martial artist, but not everything had to be resolved through force. We won't be ruining anything. The transportation route will be sealed off for a short time and return to normal afterward. The 9 States Financial Group will take care of it. They have businesses across the world, and they have connections with many governments. It'll be easy for them to smuggle goods and military resources to Warhawk and their allies' waters. It wasn't the first time that the 3 bosses of the 9 States Financial Group had been assigned a military mission, and this plan came with low risks. All they had to do was sail around the ocean and drop underwater mines. The Allied army was large, and Mifflin's resources alone weren't enough to support them. The bustling cities near Lake Isaiah were occupied by the U.S. Army, and Warhawk and their allies would have to start providing more resources for their own army and civilians if they didn't want a civil war on their hands. Warhawk and their allies' transportation routes across the ocean were shared by many countries. The moment there was a safety issue, the authorities would lock down the area to conduct a search. When they found the underwater mines that the Nine States Financial Group dropped, Warhawk and their allies would be their first suspects, because the whole world knew they were at war. Who else would be transporting weapons and equipment on a regular basis? The transportation route would be reopened as soon as the mines were removed and safety was guaranteed. None of the country's economies would be affected. With a nod of approval from Stephen, the Leviathan unit's leader left the office with confident strides to contact the Nine States Financial Group. After the poisoning incident in the mountains, Natasha and her team were no longer certain of what was or wasn't safe to be eaten. They hurriedly packed up their things and led the troops to the royal city. Farrad wasted no time and reported the bad news to Head Senator Paxton. "We've lost thousands of artificial soldiers from poison. The rate of casualties is even worse than that of the battlefield." "Why do you always make these amateur mistakes?" Paxton demanded. Farrad pretended to be wronged. "I've tried to persuade Commander Natasha not to set up camp in the mountains. It would have been safer to situate the troops in the city, but she insisted that the mountains would be better. She said the missiles at the fortress would be able to hit the U.S. border." Paxton was so angry that he was about to explode. He'd had enough of Natasha's stubborn and reckless actions. What's her next plan? "We're on our way to the outskirts of the royal city. She's thinking about asking the king for supplies, but we need to replenish the troops we lost." "Stay put in the city for now. I'll try to recruit a new commander soon." Farrad slipped his phone into his pocket, satisfied with Paxton's urgency. The small number of troops who weren't artificial soldiers participating in the war were family members of the Parliament's higher-ups. If they discovered how dangerous this battle was, they would vote to stop the war from continuing. When Javon saw Natasha and Farrad at the Imperial Palace, he wanted to cry, but he had no tears. The alchemist had been assassinated in the royal family's palace. He wasn't confident he could ensure the safety of Warhawk's army. If anything happened, he would have to bear all responsibility. "Your Highness, I trust you've been doing well since we last spoke. We've moved our troops to the outskirts of the city. We've run into some trouble, and we'd like support from the royal family." From Natasha's tone, her greeting was more like an order than a request. It made Javon uncomfortable, but he couldn't afford to worry about her threats. "The people are suffering from lack of food and supplies. Our economy has collapsed, and we barely have enough resources to survive. The only way to resolve this predicament is to end the war. Our country would be safe, and international commercial corporations would invest again." Natasha's expression darkened. That was nonsense. If the war ended, why would she need the royal family's assistance? They could take a boat home and resume their comfortable lives. Making a joke of their situation was disrespectful. "Your Highness, please take my request seriously. If the troops go hungry, we might do something dangerous." The atmosphere turned tense at her blatant threat. Nate mustered up his courage and interrupted. He'd been staying in the Imperial Palace for a long time, and he had to support Javon to show his gratitude. "Miss Natasha, you should pay more attention to how you speak. This man is the King of Cadus." Natasha's gaze shifted to Nate. "Who are you? We're having an important discussion. Outsiders should stay out of it." Nate straightened the lapels of his suit proudly. "I'm the CEO of Alliance Security Company. I'm no one special. I can't compare to the commander of Warhawk's Special Forces, but let me remind you about the martial artists in my company. They only need a few minutes to annihilate your army." Natasha looked Nate up and down. He wasn't even a martial artist. "You're the mercenaries' boss?" "That's right. Our company has signed a contract with Cadus's royal family to protect the king, the ministers, and the other staff at the Imperial Palace. I suggest you avoid testing our patience." Nate was bluffing. After the alchemist's assassination, the remaining mercenaries were in no mood to pay attention to their lousy company, let alone abide by the terms of the contract. But Natasha and Farrad had witnessed firsthand how intense a fight involving mercenaries could be. Their destructive potential exceeded human weapons. If Warhawk's army fought with the mercenaries, the artificial soldiers' bodies would pile up on the outskirts of the royal city and make their situation even worse. Javon stepped between Nate and Natasha and tried to placate them. The palace's security is important, but so are our limited resources. Give me some time to find a solution. Please return to your rooms for now. The war wasn't the only reason behind the rapid deterioration of Cadis's economy. The Stonebrave family had carried out Stephen's orders and smuggled the wealthy families out of the country before Warhawk could steal their wealth for themselves. They were the mainstay of the economy, and their absence left a huge gap behind. The Stonebrave family had helped wealthy families register their businesses at the eastern U.S. port, recruit employees, and begin company operations. Cadis's wealthy families had enough money to last them a lifetime, but a country ruined by war wouldn't preserve their wealth or their future generations. The U.S. ensured their safety and their prosperity. During the break in the war, Stephen went to the Economic and Trade Bureau to check on the newly established enterprises. Quite a few wealthy business families near our eastern border moved to other states or settled down at the eastern port, the staff reported. Stephen wasn't surprised. Economic decline was inevitable. War wasn't typically associated with prosperity, but the initial preparations for the war with Mifflin had pulled the country through the worst economic decline that had occurred when the virus first spread. What he wasn't expecting was the development at the eastern port. The staff went on. After the war broke out, the eastern port area approved thousands of acres of industrial and commercial land. Wealthy families from the U.S. and Cadis are currently active. The countries were a mess when the virus first appeared, but since then, strict follow-up management and quarantine protocols have been implemented in a timely manner, and the situation has been improving. The economy around the world is on the road to recovery. The routes at sea that were closed because of the virus had recently reopened at the eastern port. Most of the companies are seeing profits again. When the staff mentioned the virus, Stephen was reminded of Dr. Dalton's research for a cure using the blood of a beast with antivenom properties. Last time, the researchers were adjusting the ratio of the beast's serum with the human's white blood cells to minimize rejection. Weeks had passed since then. Stephen wondered if they'd made any progress. Mirage Island had become a transit point for entry and exit across the border. The number of people coming and going had been increasing as the days went by. The hustle and bustle made it hard for Dr. Dalton and his team to concentrate, so they'd moved their project to Annapolis's Research Institute for some peace and quiet. The virus was losing steam, and they had to continue with the research. The virus had spread once, and there was no guarantee it wouldn't mutate and evolve further down the line. A black limousine pulled up to the main entrance of the Research Institute. The Leviathan unit members on guard duty hurried over to greet Stephen when he stepped out. He was impressed with the building's aesthetic. From afar, it looked like a garden. Dr. Dalton has made arrangements for the renovation, a Leviathan unit member explained. Nature calms the mind and soothes the soul. The laboratory inside the institute was the same as before. Hundreds of red test tubes were inside the glass cabinet. A long needle had been inserted into the cork to test the changes in blood sample. Dr. Dalton was sitting at his desk, staring at the computer. He was so focused on his research that he didn't know Stephen had entered the lab until he called out to him. Dr. Dalton returned Stephen's greeting as he tiredly set his glasses down on the desk. We've created a sample and tested it. It works, but it's limited to patients who were infected no more than a week ago. We haven't had time to mass produce it. With the isolation protocols in place, there's been fewer cases of infection, but we'll do our best to develop a more effective cure.